Chapter 9, Part 2 of From Sail to Steam by Alfred Thayer Mahan. This recording is in the public domain. Chapter 9, A Roundabout Road to China, 1867. Part 2. The French occupation of Madagascar postdates our visit to it. The harbor we entered, St. Augustine's Bay on the west side, was only nominally under control of the native dynasty at Antananarivo, in the center of the island, and the local inhabitants were little, if at all, above barbarism. Though dark in color, they had not the flat Negro features. Wandering with a companion through a jungle, having lost our way, we came unexpectedly upon a group of brown people scantily dressed, the most conspicuous member of which was a woman carrying a spear a little taller than herself, the head of which was burnished till it shone like silver. Whether a weapon or simply a badge of rank, I do not know. They rose to meet us in friendly enough fashion, and had English sufficient to set us on our way. The place was frequented by whalers, who occasionally shipped hands from among the natives. One such came on board the Iroquois, and within a limited range spoke English fluently. Our chief acquaintance was known to us as Prince George, and I presume had some personal importance in the neighborhood. He was of use in obtaining supplies, hanging about the deck all day, obligingly ready at any moment to take a glass of wine or a cigar, and seemingly even a little sulky when he was not asked to table. The men dressed their hair in peculiar fashion, gathered together in little globes about the size of a golf ball, distributed somewhat symmetrically over the skull, and plastered with a substance that looked like blue mud. As I refrained from close inspection, I cannot pronounce certainly what it was. From St. Augustine's Bay we went on to the Comoro Islands, between the north end of Madagascar and the African mainland. I do not know what was then the precise political status of this pleasant-looking group, except that one of them had for some years been under French control. Johanna, at which we stopped, possessed at the least a qualified self-government. We had a good sight of its surface, approaching from the south and skirting at moderate distance westward to reach the principal anchorage, Johanna town, on the north. The island is lofty, 5,000 feet, and of volcanic origin, bearing the family likeness which I have found in all such that I have seen. On a bright day, which we had, they are very picturesque to look on from the sea, with their deep gullies, ragged precipices, and varied hues, especially striking from the effects of light and shadow produced by the exaggerated inequalities of the ground. It is hard to say which are the more attractive, these or the totally different low coral islands of the tropics, with their brilliant white sand, encircled by which, as by a setting of silver, the deep green brush glows like an emerald. It is hard, however, to make other than a pleasing picture with a combination of blue water and land. Like flowers, they may be more or less tastefully arranged, but scarcely can be less than beautiful. In the way of landscape effect, Johanna had a special feature of its own. Up to a height of about 1,500 feet from sea level, the slopes were of a tawny hue, the color of grass when burned up by drought. Except scattered waving cocoanut palms, which grew even on these hillsides, no green thing was apparent, save in the ravines, where trees seemed to thrive, and so broke the monotony of tint with streaks of sombre verdure. Farther up, the peaks were thickly covered with a forest, which looked impenetrable. The abrupt contrast of the yellow lower land with this cap of tanglewood, itself at times covered, at times only dotted, with fleecy clouds, was singularly vivid. The inhabitants of the island were Arabs, mixed with some Negro blood, and wore the Oriental costume now so familiar to us in this age of illustration. The ship was besieged by them at once, and throughout our stay, at all hours that they were permitted to come on board. They were cleanly in person, as their religion prescribes, and applied no offensive substance to their hair. On the contrary, some pleasant perfume was perceptible about their clothing. The coloring generally was dark, although some, among whom was the ruler, called the Sultan, had olive skins. But the features were clear and prominent, the stature and form good, the bearing manly, nor did they seem other than intelligent. Their teeth, too, were fine, when not disfigured by the chewing of the betel nut, which, when long continued, stains them a displeasing dark red. Like all barbarians, they talked till one was nearly deafened. On one occasion a group of them favored us with a theological exposition, marked by somewhat elementary conceptions. The ship was a perfect Babel at meal times, when the intermission of work allowed the freest visiting. Every man who came brought at least a half dozen fowl, with sweet potatoes, fruit, and eggs to match; and as in addition to our own crew bargaining, there were on deck some 50 or 60 natives, all vociferating, bartering, beseeching, or yelling to the 50 others in canoes alongside, the tumult and noise may be conceived. The chickens, too, both cocks and hens, present by the hundred in basket work cages, made no small contribution to the general uproar. Chickens, indeed, numerous though not large, are among the chief food commodities of that region, the usual price, as I recollect, being $1 the dozen. When we left Johanna, we must have had on board several hundred as sea stock. Not infrequently one would get out of its cage, and if pursued would often end by flapping overboard, so by drowning anticipating its appointed doom. But it was a pathetic sight to see the poor creature, upborne by its feathers so long as dry, floating on the waste of waters in the wake of the ship which seemed almost heartlessly to forsake it. The faith of the island being Mohammedan, we found it safe to give a large liberty to the crew. Especially, if I rightly recall, I availed myself of the circumstances to let go certain ne'er-do-wells whose conduct under temptation was not to be depended on. We had the unprecedented experience that they all came back on time and sober, thus avouching that the precepts of the Prophet concerning rum were obeyed in Johanna. Exemplary in this, it would be difficult to say otherwise on what precise rung of the ladder stretching from barbarism to civilization these people stood. In manner toward us they were pleasant and smiling, not averse to the arts of diplomacy, but perhaps a little transparent in their approaches to a desired object. I went on shore one Friday, their Sunday, which was inadvertent on my part, for their religious duties interfered with customary routine. One and another excused themselves to me on the plea that they must go to pray. I was known, however, to be an authority on board, which produced for me some simple hospitality, principally not very inviting lemonade, attentions that I soon found to be not wholly disinterested. Next day one of my hosts came on board and interviewed me with many bows. The Iroquois very fine ship, much better than English ship. Captain English very good man, and first lieutenant, myself, he very good man. And the complimenter would like certain articles within the gift of the said very good man, together with a note to bearer, permitting him to come aboard at any time. Being by this some weeks away from Cape Town, we sent our wash ashore, a resort of desperation. It came back clean enough, but for ironing, well, and as to starch, much in the predicament of Boatswain Chuck's frilled shirts after the gale, upon which, while flying in the breeze, he looked with a degree of professional philosophy that could express itself only by thrashing the cooper. Crumpled would be a mild expression for our linen. We remonstrated, but were met with a shrug of the shoulders and a deprecatory but imperturbable smile. Yes, Johanna wash. And Johanna, we found, we were expected to receive as a sufficient explanation for any deficiencies in any line. If not satisfactory to us, it was at least modest in them. Grave courtesies, ceremonious in conception, if rather rudimentary in execution, were exchanged between us and the authorities of Johanna. Our captain returned the visit of the official in charge of the place, and subsequently called upon the Sultan, who came to the town while we were there. I went along on the first occasion. Upon reaching the beach, we found a guard of some 40 negro soldiers, whose equipment as to shoes resembled that of the Barbadian company immortalized in Peter Simple. But in this instance there was no attempt at that decorous regard for externals which ordered those with both shoes and stockings to fall in the front rank, and those with neither to keep in the rear. They were commanded by a young Arab, who seemed very anxious to do all in style, rising on tiptoe at the several orders, which he jerked out with vim, and, to my surprise, in English. When duly pointed, we marched off to the sound of a drum, accompanied by a peculiar monotonous wail on a kind of trumpet; the order of the procession being 1, music; 2, the soldiers, led by an old sergeant in a high state of excitement and coat collar, which held the poor fellow's head like a vice; and 3, our captain and his attendants. The visit to the Sultan, 2 days later, was marked by additional features, indicative, I presume, of the greater dignity of the event, the captain being now carried in a chair, with a red silk umbrella over his head. Between 3 and 4 years before our visit, the Confederate steamer Alabama had stopped at Johanna, and so at least our friends told us. Semmes had promised them a Yankee whaler or two. Whether he found the whalers or not, I cannot say; but to the Johannese it was a Barmecide feast, or, like the anticipation of Sisera's ladies, to every man a damsel or two. To use their own quaint English, the next thing they heard of the Alabama, he go down. We left Johanna with the southwest monsoon, which in the Indian Ocean and China Sea blows from June to September with the regularity of the trade winds of the Atlantic, both in direction and force. There the favorable resemblance ends, for in the region through which we were passing this monsoon is overcast, usually gloomy, and excessively damp. The northeast monsoon, which prevails during the winter months, is clear and dry. The consequent struggle with shoe leather, and the deterioration of the same, is disheartening. But though surcharged with moisture, rain does not fall to any great extent in the open sea, nor until the atmospheric current impinges on land, when it seems to be squeezed like a sponge by the hand, with resultant precipitation. Our conditions were therefore pleasant enough. Being under sail only, the wind went faster than we, giving a cooling breeze as it passed over, and it was as steady and moderate as it was fair for our next destination, Aden, to reach which we were now pointing for Cape Guardafui. The Iroquois ran along steadily northward, 6 to 8 knots, followed by a big sea, but so regular that she rolled only with a slow, steady swing, not disagreeable. The veiled sun showed sufficiently for sights, without burning heat, and by the same token we passed that luminary on our course; that is, he was north of us while at Johanna, and one day on this run we got north of him. This must have been after we had crossed the equator, for being August, the sun was still north of the line. This reminds me that the day we thus passed the sun, our navigator, usually very exact, applied his declination wrong at noon, which gave us a wrong latitude. For a few minutes the discrepancy between the observation and the log caused a shaking of heads. The log doubtless fell under an unmerited suspicion, or else we had encountered a current not hitherto noted in the books, the usual solvent in such perplexities. I may explain for the unlearned in navigation that declination of a heavenly body corresponds in the celestial sphere to the latitude of an object on the terrestrial. The sun, being a leisurely celestial globe-trotter, continually varies his latitude, declination, within a zone bounded by the 2 tropics, and the rule runs that when his declination is of the same name, north or south, as his direction from the ship at noon, the declination is added or subtracted, I now forget which, in the computation that ascertains the vessel's precise position. This has to be remembered when he is passing overhead in the zenith, for then the bearing changes, while his declination remains of the same name. If the resulting error is large, of course the mistake is detected immediately. A small difference might pass unnoted with dangerous consequences. At Johanna, or possibly at St. Augustine's, some of our officers and men, moved by that queer propensity of mankind to acquire strange objects, however useless, had bought animals of the kind called mongoose. There were perhaps a half dozen of these in all. The result was that most of them, one way or another, escaped and took refuge aloft in the rigging, where it was as hopeless to attempt recapture as for a man to pursue a gray squirrel in a tree. The poor beggars had achieved their liberty, however, without the proverbial crust of bread or cup of water, and in consequence, after fasting all day, gave themselves to predatory nocturnal forays, which were rather startling when unexpectedly aroused by them from sleep. The wardroom pantry was near my berth, and I remember being awakened by a great commotion and scuffling, as one or more utensils were upset and knocked about in the unhappy beast's attempt to get at water kept there in a little cask. No reconcilement between them and man was effected, and one by one they dropped overboard, the victims of accident or suicide, noted or unnoted, to their deliverance and our relief. While they lasted, it was pathetic to watch their furtive movements and unrelaxed vigilance, jealously guarding the freedom which was held under such hopeless surroundings, and must cost them so dear at last. When the ship had rounded Cape Guardafui and fairly entered the Strait of Bab el Mandeb, the alteration of weather conditions was immediate and startling. The heat became all at once intense and dry. From the latter circumstance the relief was great. I remember that many years afterwards, having spent a month or more determining a site for a navy yard in Puget Sound, where the temperature is delightful but the atmosphere saturated, I experienced a similar sense of bodily comfort when we reached Arizona, returning by the Southern Pacific Railroad. One morning I got up from the sleeper and walked out into the rare, crisp air of a way station, delighted to find myself literally as dry as a bone, and a very old bone too, tertiary period, let us say. The sudden change in the strait proved fatal to one of our officers. He had been ailing for a few days, but on the night after we doubled the Cape, woke up from a calm sleep in wild delirium, and in a brief period died from the bursting of an aneurysm, an effect which the surgeon attributed to the abrupt increase of heat. I may add that, though dry, the air was felt by us to be debilitating. During the 10 days passed in the Gulf, young as I then was, I was indisposed to any unusual bodily or mental effort. What breeze reached us, coming over desert from every direction, was like the blast of a furnace, although the height of the thermometer was not excessive. It was scarcely fair to Aden to visit it in midsummer, but our voyage had not been timed with reference to seasons or our comfort. I shall not weary a reader with any attempt at description of the treeless surroundings and barren lava crags that constitute the scenery, which moreover many may have seen for themselves. What chiefly interested me were the Jews and the camels. Like Gibraltar, and in less measure Key West, Aden is a place where meet many and diverse peoples from Asia, from Africa, and from Europe. Furthermore, it has had a long and checkered history, and this, at an important center on a commercial route, tends to the gathering of incongruous elements. English, Arabs, Parsees from India, Somalis from Africa across the Gulf, sepoy soldiers, and Jews, all were to be met, and in varieties of costume for which we had not been prepared by our narrow experience of Oriental dress in Johanna. The Jews most attracted my attention, an attraction of repulsion to the type there exhibited, though I am without anti-Semitic feeling. That Jesus Christ was a Jew covers his race for me. These were reported to have enjoyed in earlier times a period of much prosperity, which had been destroyed in one of the dramatic political reverses frequent in Eastern annals. Since then they had remained a degraded and abject class. Certainly they were externally a very peculiar and unprepossessing people. The physiognomy commonly associated with the name Jew was very evident, though the cast of feature had been brutalized by ages of oppression and servility. A singular distinctive mark was the wearing on both sides of the forehead long curls falling to the shoulders. cringing and subservient in manner; and as traders there was yet apparent behind the Uriah Heep exterior a fierce cruelty of expression which would make a mob hideous if once let loose. A mob, indeed, is ever terrible, but these men reconstituted for me, with added vividness, the scene and cry of "Crucify him!" Although I was new to the East, camels in their uncouth form and shambling gait had been made familiar by menageries; but in Aden I first saw them in the circumstances which give the sense of appropriateness necessary to the completeness of an impression, and indeed to its enjoyment. Environment is assuredly more essential to appreciation than is commonly recognized. Does beer taste as good in America as in England? I think not, unless perhaps in Newport, Rhode Island. Climatic, doubtless. I have been told by Englishmen that the very best pineapples to be had are raised in England under glass. Very good, but where is your tropical heat to supply the appreciative palate? I remember in a railway train in Guatemala some women came along with pineapples. I gave 5 cents, expecting one fruit. She, unwilling to make change, forced upon me 3. Small, yes, pygmies, doubtless, to the hothouse aristocrats; but at a dinner table with artificial heat could one possibly want them as much, or enjoy them as keenly, as under the burning southern sun, eaten like an apple, the juices streaming to the ground? A camel, sauntering down Broadway, would be odd only. A camel in an Eastern street has the additional setting needed to fix him accurately in your gallery of mental pictures; though for the matter of fact, I suppose a desert would be a still more fitting surrounding. Aden has no natural water supply for daily use. One of the sights are the great tanks for storing it, constructed by some bygone dynasty. When we were there, the place relied for emergencies upon the more modern expedient of condensers, but for ordinary consumption was mainly dependent upon that brought in skins from the adjacent country on the backs of camels, which returned charged with merchandise. I watched one of these ships of the desert being laden for the homeward voyage. He was on his knees, placidly chewing the cud of his last meal, but with a watchful eye behind him upon his master's movements. Eternal vigilance, the price of liberty, or at least the safeguard against oppression, was clearly his conviction. Nor did he believe in that outworn proverb not to yell before you are hurt. As each additional package, small or big, was laid on the accumulating burden, he stretched out his long neck, craned it around to the rear, opening his mouth as though to bite, to which he seemed full fain, at the same time emitting a succession of cries more wrathful even than dolorous, though this also they were. But the wail of the sufferer went unheeded, and deservedly, for when the load was complete to the last pound, he rose, obedient to signal, and stepped off quietly, evidently at ease. He had had his grumble, and was satisfied. An impression which accumulates upon the attentive traveller following the main roads of maritime commerce is the continual outcropping of the British soldier. It is not that there is so much of him, but that he is so manywhere. In our single voyage, at places so apart as Cape Town, Aden, Bombay, Singapore, Hong Kong, although not on our route, nevertheless linked to the 4 last named by the great ocean highway between East and West, consecutive even in those distant days before the Suez Canal, he was already in force in Gibraltar and Malta, since which he is to be found in Cyprus also and in Egypt. He is no chance phenomenon, but an obvious effect of a noteworthy cause, an incident of current history, the exponent unconsciously to himself of many great events. In our country we have wisely learned to scrutinize with distrust arguments for manifest destiny, but it is nevertheless well to note and ponder a manifest present which speaks to a manifest past. From Aden the Iroquois ran along the southern coast of Arabia to Muscat, within the entrance of the Persian Gulf. Here, after leaving the open sea, we met a recurrence of the heat, and in general features of the scenery we had left at Aden, the whole confirming the association of the name Arabia with scorching and desert. The cove of Muscat, though a mere indentation of the shore line, furnishes an excellent harbor, being sheltered by a rocky island which constitutes a natural breakwater. There is considerable trade, and the position is naturally strong for defence, with encircling cliffs upon which forts have been built. But from our experience, told below, it is probable that their readiness did not correspond to their formidable aspect. From the anchorage of the Iroquois, the town was hardly to be descried, the gray color of the stone used in construction blending with the background of the mountains, from which probably it had been quarried. But nearer it is imposing in appearance, there being several minarets and some massive buildings, among which the ruins of a Portuguese cathedral bear their mute testimony to a transitory era in the long history of the East. During our stay there was some disturbance in the place. Our information was that the reigning sovereign had killed his father 2 years before, and that in consequence, either through revenge or jealousy, his father's brother kept him constantly stirred up by invasion or threats of invasion from the inner country. Such an alarm postponed for the moment a ceremonious visit which our captain was to pay, but it took place next day. As it called for full uniform, I begged off. Those who went returned with unfavorable reports, both of the town and of the Sultan. A rather funny incident here attended our exchange of civilities. In ports where there is cause to think that the expenditure of powder may be inconvenient to your hosts, or that for any reason they may not return a salute, it is customary first to inquire whether the usual national honors to the flag will be acceptable and duly answered, gun for gun. In Aden, being British, of course no questions were asked, but in Muscat I presume they were, for failure to give full measure creates a diplomatic incident and correspondence. At all events, we saluted 21 guns, to which the castle replied. When the tale was but half complete, there came from one of its cannons a huge puff of smoke, but no accompanying report. "Shall I count that?" shouted the quartermaster, whose special duty was to keep tally that we got our full pound of flesh. A general laugh followed. The impression had resembled that produced by an impassioned orator, the waving of whose arms you see, without hearing the words which give point to his gesticulations, and the quartermaster's query drove home the absurdity. It was solemnly decided, however, that that should be reckoned a gun. The intention was good, if result was imperfect. We had been done out of our noise, but we had had our smoke, and in these days of smokeless powder it is hopeful to record an instance of noiseless. In those few indolent days which we drowsed away in the heat of Muscat, one thing I noticed was the vivid green of the water, especially in patches near the shore and in the crevices of the rocky basin. I wonder, did Moore have a hint of this or draw upon his imagination? Certainly it was there, a green more brilliant than any I have ever seen elsewhere, and of different shade. No pearl ever lay under Oman's green water, more pure in its shell than thy spirit in thee. After the comparatively sequestered series of St. Augustine's Bay, the Comoros, Aden, and Muscat, our next port, Bombay, seemed like returning to city hubbub and accustomed ways. True, Indian life was strange to most of our officers, if not to all, but there was about Bombay that which made you feel you had got back into the world, albeit in many particulars as different from that you had hitherto known as Rip Van Winkle found after his long slumber. Then, a decade only after the Great Mutiny, travel to India for travel's sake was much more rare than now. The railway system, that great promoter of journeyings, was not complete. 2 years later, when returning from China, I found opportunity to go overland from Calcutta to Bombay, but in the interior had to make a long stage by carriage between Jubbulpore and Nagpur. Since that time many have visited and many have written. I shall therefore spare myself and my possible readers the poor portrayal of that which has been already and better described. Johnson's advice to Boswell, "Tell me what you have observed yourself," I take to mean something different from those externals the sight of which is common to all, unless, as in the Corsica of Boswell, few go to see them. What you see is that which you personally have the faculty of perceiving; depends upon you as much as upon the object itself. It may not be worth reporting, but it is all you have. I do not think I remember of Bombay anything peculiarly my own. I do recall the big snakes we saw lying apparently asleep on the sea 50 or 60 miles from land. Perhaps readers who have not visited the East may not know that such modified sea serpents are to be seen there, as is a smaller variety in the Strait of Malacca. From Bombay we made a long leg to Singapore. We had sailed in early February. It was now late September, and our captain, as I have said before, began to feel anxious to reach the station. Owing to this haste, we omitted Ceylon and Calcutta, which did not correspond to the expectation or the wishes of the admiral, and we missed, as I think, orders sent us to take in Siam before coming to Hong Kong. It is very doubtful whether, had we received them, we should have seen more of interest than awaited us shortly after our arrival in Japan. At all events, as in duty bound, I shall imitate my captain, and skip rapidly over this intervening period. There is in it nothing that would justify my formed intention not to enlarge upon that which others have seen and told. We made the run to Singapore at the change of the monsoon toward the end of September, and at that time a quiet passage is likely, unless you are so unlucky as to encounter one of the cyclones which frequently attend the break up of the season at this transition period. There is a tendency nowadays to discredit the equinox as a storm breeder. As regards the particular day, doubtless recognition of a general fact may have lapsed into superstition as to a date. But in considering the phenomena of the monsoons, the great fixed currents of air blowing alternately to and from the heated or cooled continent of Asia, it seems only reasonable, when the two are striving for predominance, to expect the uncertain and at times terrific weather which, as a matter of experience, does occur about the period of the autumnal equinox in the India and China seas. But after we had made our southing from Bombay, our course lay nearly due east, with a fresh, fair west wind within 5 degrees of the equator, a zone wherein cyclonic disturbance seldom intrudes. One of the complaints made by residents against the climate of Singapore, so pleasant to a stranger, is the wearisome monotony. Close to the equator, it has too much sameness of characteristic, toujours perdrix. Winter doubtless adds to our appreciation of summer. For all that, I personally am ready to dispense with snow. From Singapore, another commercial center with variety of inhabitants, we carried the same smooth water up to Manila, where we stopped a few days for coal. This was the first of 2 visits paid while on the station to this port, which not our wildest imagination expected ever to see under our flag. Long as American eyes had been fixed upon Cuba, in the old days of negro slavery, it had occurred to none, I fancy, to connect possession of that island with these distant Spanish dependencies. Here our quiet environment was lost. The northeast monsoon had set in full force when we started for Hong Kong, and the run across was made under steam and fore and aft canvas, which we were able to carry close on the wind. A wet passage, throwing a good deal of water about, but with a brilliant sky and delightful temperature. It would be hard to exaggerate the beauty of the weather which this wind brings. In the northern American states we have autumnal spells like it, but along the Chinese coast it continues in uninterrupted succession for magnificent days, with hardly a break for 3 or 4 months. An invigorating breeze always blowing, the thermometer ranging between 50 degrees and 60 degrees, a cloudless sky, the air perfectly dry, so that furniture and wood fittings shrink and crack audibly. As rain does not fall during this favored season, the dust becomes objectionable. But that drawback does not extend to shipboard. The man must be unreasonable who doubts life being worth living during the northeast monsoon. Hong Kong is just within the tropics, and experiences probably the coolest weather of any tropical port. Key West, in the same latitude, is well enough in a Gulf of Mexico norther; that is, if you too are well. The last time I saw General Winfield Scott, once our national military hero, was there during a norther. I had called, and found him in misery, his gigantic frame swathed in heavy clothing, his face pallid with cold. He explained that he liked always to be in a gentle perspiration, and had come to Key West in search of such conditions. These the place usually affords, but the houses are not built to shut out the chill which accompanies a hard norther. The general was then 80, and died within the year. End of chapter 9.